Welcome to the Get Published podcast, sponsored by Brodie Consulting Group. To get more information about our coaching, publishing, executive ghostwriting, and podcast production services, go to getpublishedpodcast.com. Hello, I am Paul Brodie, and thank you for joining us for another episode of the Get Published podcast, where we help authors get published with a proven system that works. Today, we're being joined by Sandra Younger, author of The Fire Outside My Window. A survivor tells the true story of California's epic Cedar Fire. Sandra, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Paul. I'm honored to be here.
Are you ready to get started?
Let's do it.
All right. Question number 1. What is the one piece of advice that you would give to a first-time author who is currently writing their book?
The one piece of advice I would give is to find some support, whether that's a writing coach, whether that's a class, whether that's a reading critique group. Find some sort of accountability and support, because writing is a lonely pursuit. And writing a book especially just seems at first like climbing Mount Everest, and it's just too easy to quit or to get discouraged or to kind of lose your rhythm. So for me, what's worked is being a part of a reading critique group at a writers organization that we have here in San Diego, California, where I live. And now I actually facilitate one of those groups for other writers.
Well, and you bring up such a great point, because you have to have accountability and you have to have a support system, whether that's using a coach or a publisher or using support groups and other authors. It's such an important thing to have as you're going through this journey.
It really is, because it's just too easy to not, to blow off your own goals. And if you've got a group meeting or a coach appointment on Wednesday night, you're going to sit down and write something before Wednesday night. Yeah. So that's why I think it was so invaluable. Also, because a group has a tendency to validate you as a writer. I know I went into my group feeling a little intimidated, even though I was a journalist, Paul. I have 2 degrees in journalism. I had been writing professionally for 28 years at the time. And I went into this group feeling intimidated because they were fiction writers and I was writing nonfiction, which I found out was just ridiculous to be concerned. But what really helped me from the very first time I met with them was they accepted me. They clearly accepted me as a fellow writer. And having that kind of validation is so important. And anyone who's listening, if you wonder if you're a writer, if you're writing, yes, you're a writer. And it's just nice to have other writers that you look at as real writers, whatever that means, to tell you that. And sometimes these people become really good friends. We had 3 people from that critique group, which is several years ago now, who published books, and then we could all go to each other's launch parties, and it was really terrific because we had become close friends supporting one another. We still see each other socially even now.
Now, did you guys meet locally every week to go through your books, or what was the process?
We did. Well, this was called an advanced reading critique group. There are many different ways people can run reading critique groups, and this one was in person. Although, you can do it virtually. You can find virtual groups as well. But we met at the facilitator's home usually every Wednesday night. And this was we were sort of pushing the envelope because we did 15 pages a week. So we had to turn in our 15 pages by Sunday night to give us all a chance to read each other's pages. We had a max of 8 people in the group, a max of 4 people reading per week. And so we'd all go through it, we'd make notes, and then we'd come together in person on Wednesday night and we'd share our notes and talk about what we loved and what didn't work for us as readers, where things could be improved.
Well, I really like that you have that accountability piece where you have homework, and your homework is to get 15 pages done a week, and we're going to meet Wednesday night at the facilitator's house, and make sure you bring your homework with you.
Well, make sure you send your homework out by Sunday night even. And there were many Sunday afternoons when I was like pedal to the metal. And at first I was kind of frustrated with that pace. Now I know that that was like, reading critique on steroids, because in my own group that I facilitate, we do 5 pages a week, and that's a lot. But because you're doing, multiple people, like you do 4 times 5 pages, that's 20 pages you got to look at and critique and write notes about before you get together. So we were doing 15. And at first I was frustrated with that pace because I'd already written 2/3 of my manuscript, Paul. And I thought, all right, I want to get going on this. Let's get through this. I've got pages waiting. Why can't I read every week? But then I burned through that first 2/3 of the book, and then I had to generate pages every 2 weeks, which suddenly changed my mind about the pace of the group, I'll tell you.
Well, what do you feel is the hardest part about getting published?
For me, the hardest part was just finishing the manuscript. I will tell you, it was from inception to launch party. It was 10 years to get my book done. And that, I mean, for me, just to keep going was the hardest part, which is why my number one piece of advice is to get some support and accountability to help you keep going and to buoy you when you hit a slump. That was the hardest thing, was just getting the thing written. And part of the reason for me is this was a different kind of book than perhaps many of, I don't know the breadth of genre that you deal with your listeners and your clients, but a lot of people in the entrepreneurial space write what we call prescriptive nonfiction or how-to books, right? Mm-hmm. And sometimes those books can be very brief. Sometimes they can be just a sort of a written version of someone's signature talk. And that's fine. And they become sort of a business card book. But what I was writing was more involved. It was a journalistic endeavor where I did over 100 interviews, probably closer to 150 interviews. And it took time to get those interviews scheduled. In a couple cases, there was legal action about the origin of this fire that I wrote about, which was for 14 years the biggest wildfire in California history that happened here in San Diego 15 years ago this month. And it took a long time to get those interviews done. And then I had all of these interviews I had to collate into one integrated narrative stream. So what I was writing was narrative nonfiction. And it was tough, but still 10 years is kind of a long slog.
Well, the main thing is you got it done. And that's the most important thing.
That's the main thing. I mean, I got to a point where I thought, am I even going to finish this before I die? Please let me finish this before I die. And I did. And that's the other good news, that even though the hardest part is keep going, if you can keep going, one day you get to that glorious place where you realize, I'm done. I have made this just as good as I possibly can. It is everything I set out for it to be, and I'm turning it in with a clear conscience and just great celebration and gratitude, because it is done. And now my book's been done for 5 years. I can't even believe it, and I'm working on another one now. For a while, I didn't want to work on another one. I was just spent, but now I'm finally feeling the urge to do something new.
I'm in the same boat. Excuse me. I'm in the same boat right now. I just finished about 3 months ago, I finished my 13th book. And,
holy moly.
And now I'm ready to get book number 14 done, which is ironically enough on how to build a podcast. So I'm finally getting that book done today. I met with my team and I'm like, okay, this book is getting done. Now we're going to start the process. We're going to get it done. Good. And then what we also do, in addition to publishing, we've recently expanded out to one specific area of ghostwriting, because as you mentioned, doing narratives and fiction and everything else, it's very difficult to do. So one thing that we're specializing now is essentially working with CEOs and business owners to create those business books that you talked about, and you basically doing that through a Q&A format. So it's basically going from interviewing others and getting these books done to focusing on my own book. And I think that's one of the challenges when you have all these other things that go on, and you have to realize, okay, now it's time to get my book done, and let's get started.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and and after you launch a major book, it takes up a lot of your time. It becomes like this child you have to nurture. And even now, though I haven't done another major book in the meantime, I have done some some more prescriptive books. I'm doing these podcasts. I'm speaking. I have a platform now that I'm an author, which is another important note I like to make to people who are struggling to get that signature book done is you already have a book when it's in manuscript form or even halfway through, and you read it and you can say, hey, I think this is pretty good. Or maybe if you're self-deprecating, somebody else would read it and say, you know what, Paul, this is really good. Quit dissing yourself, as a lot of authors do. But not until you actually get it published are you truly an author with a platform. You know what I mean?
And you're absolutely correct. One of the things I always talk about at live events or on the show is that the book is the foundation of your business platform, and then taking these other things to leverage it, like having your own podcast or offering different services and basically expanding upon that. But the foundation begins with your book.
Right. And you can be every bit as much an expert on your topic before you write a book, but the book gives you credibility in people's eyes. It's too bad because I feel like it's almost become expected that everybody in business has a book. And, I don't know that everybody needs to or should have to write a book. I mean, there's so many books out there, but it's become expected, for better or for worse. And it does give you that credibility and that foundation to your platform.
Yeah, I think at this point it's like it's a prerequisite, especially when you're starting out a business and growing it and wanting to leverage it, is that you need to have that book.
You pretty much do now, right? And that is kind of a new development. It didn't used to be the case, but it is for now.
Well, and the other thing is you have to market it, and that's going to transition really well into our next question in regards to marketing. So please share a marketing strategy that you have used in your book launch that worked well.
Well, here's what I did. And I will say I went through, as I said, I was a journalist, so I felt like I should be able to do this the traditional way, and I want to do this the traditional way. And so I found an agent who found a publisher. The publisher, though, which is also sometimes considered the holy grail of becoming an author, right? I have an agent, I have a publisher. The publisher did pretty much diddly squat to market my book, Paul. And I had to do almost everything. I will tell you what the publisher did. Now, keep in mind, the publisher has purchased this. This is now an asset to their company. Why are they not marketing it so that they can make money off of it? Because publishers make 90% of the money off of the books that are sold. I don't know. I don't know why they don't market it. But here's what they did. They sent out a press release, which fortunately they ran by me first because they didn't even spell my name correctly. And I had to rewrite the entire press release. They had handed this off to a publicist, right? The editor I worked with was awesome. The publicist, not so much. So she wrote this half-baked press release that I redid and supposedly sent it with a copy of a book to about 100 media outlets to get reviews. The only real review we got was from the San Diego Union Tribune, my hometown paper, which would have happened anyway. So, and the other thing they did to market my book was they sent me a great big poster sized cover, so I could put it on an easel when I go speak. So that was it. That was all she wrote. So here's what I did. I did everything I could. And one of the things I did that was helpful was get some media training and get myself on local TV. And one of the characteristics some people saw in my book was that it was a local story. I tend to think And I still think it was a universal story, especially when you see in the news all the disasters are happening around us every day. This is a universal story about what happens to people and to emergency responders in the midst and the aftermath of a natural disaster. Dateline thought it was a universal story because they did a 2-hour special on it. But I'm digressing now. I was primarily talking to local audiences at the time. And because I got myself on local TV talk shows, which is not that hard, actually, because they're looking for material every day, I was discovered by the firefighters. So this is interesting because, I was hoping my book would be discovered by Oprah, and Oprah didn't find it. And I don't know how you get a book to Oprah. If you know, Paul, let me know, because all I could find is dead ends trying to get my book to Oprah. But even though Oprah didn't find it, the firefighters found it. And the firefighters then invited me to be a presenter at some of their trainings. They adopted my book as a case study for this 3-day course for top-level emergency managers and incident commanders. The firefighters became my go-to group, and that is where most of my sales continue to happen. So I think that a very smart marketing strategy would be to target groups that align with your message and would be specifically interested in your book. I was lucky they happened to find me because I was a local TV. I think that is the most advantage I got out of being on TV. But that is what happened. So that's my marketing strategy. Find a group that will champion your book for you.
Now, with the process to get on local television, what was your process to do that? How were you able to pitch these stations?
Well, I paid a lot of money and took some training. I don't know that that's necessary. Basically, you need to pitch the producer, and you need to come up with a very brief segment proposal, and you need to come up with a hooky title. It's basic marketing. It's just like, what would you put on your homepage, right? You'd put a hooky title. You put like 3 points that drive straight to your audience's needs and concerns. So, for example, my pitch was 5 mistakes that can cost you your life in a natural disaster, and the live formula to survive a natural disaster. That was my hook. And then you start calling producers on the phone and pitching this to them. And you give them a very concise pitch, and you say, that's my segment proposal. What do you think?
It's essentially like a Q letter.
That's how you do it. Yeah, absolutely. It's a query. It's a specialized query, and you find out who the producers are for these local talk shows, usually morning talk shows. And there's a certain finesse. There are a lot of nuances to it, but basically that's the process. It's like sending a query letter to a magazine for an article, right? So you have to do a little homework in finding out who is the producer of this show, and how do I get to that person? And then you come up with a very concise, pithy, killer proposal like that and pitch them.
When it's funny, it's so similar to get on local radio stations and even the podcast.
Oh,
it's
sure.
the same thing, talking about the hook and the value that you bring, and it's
Very
the same
same
strategy that you can use everywhere.
Very same thing, right? Yeah.
Well, cool. Well, thank you for sharing that. Let's talk about your
Sure.
favorite book. So what is your favorite book? And what was the number one thing that you learned from it?
Well, I got to say, I'm glad you gave me a heads up on this, because how do you pick one favorite book? So here's what I'm going to go with. I'm going to go way back, and I'm going to say that The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn is probably the most influential book I could suggest to anyone. And, it's so old now. It's probably like 100 years old, written by the great American writer, journalist, author, humorist, Mark Twain. But that book is, it's brief, it's a quick read, it's an easy read, it's entertaining. And the one thing I learned from it, I have to go with 2 things, Paul. I'm really sorry, but
No, you're good.
The one thing is how to write, because Mark Twain, many people have called him the real father of American writing, of American fiction in particular. If you go back and read this book that is now decades old, you will be amazed at how contemporary it sounds. And the second thing to learn from Huckleberry Finn is a lesson that is so timely in our divided society about how to get along with people who are different from you. You've got Huckleberry Finn, and you've got an African American man on a raft, floating down the Mississippi River, and in the era of slavery, and they have to figure out how to work that out. And what they discover is, gosh, they're really not so different after all. I wrote an article for a magazine once about this group of college kids way back in the 60s who decided to recreate that raft trip. And they built a raft, and they hauled it to Missouri, and they floated down the Mississippi River. And what they discovered was very similar to what Huckleberry Finn discovers about prejudice and diversity and the fundamental unifying human characteristics that we all share. So it's a tale for the ages, and it's also an incredible writing text.
And for a final question, what is your favorite quote and why?
This is another tough one, Paul. This just isn't fair. There are so many millions of great quotes out there, but here's one that I'm really loving right now, and it's by Thomas Merton. For those who have never heard of him, I hadn't until a few years ago. He was a monk who lived in probably, I don't know, he was most active in the 60s, but he was a writer and a social activist, and really visionary guy. So here's what Thomas Merton says that I love. He says, "You do not need to know precisely what is happening or exactly where it is all going. What you need is to recognize the possibilities and challenges offered by the present moment, and to embrace them with courage, faith, and hope." Thomas Merton.
That's a great quote.
Isn't it?
Well, Sandra, I want to thank you for being a guest on the show. What is the best way for people to find you online?
Well, thanks for inviting me, Paul. People can find me online at my website, sandrayounger.com, SandraYounger.com. And there's a contact form there if you want to send me a note.
Well, Sandra, I want to thank you once again for being on the show, and I wish you all the best in your author journey ahead.
Thank you so much, Paul, and thanks for all you're doing to help would-be authors become actual authors. That's awesome.
Thanks again for joining us today. To learn more about how you can be featured in our brand new Get Published business book, go to getpublishedpodcast.com.